should be a 3-minute video. Ready?
5:30 a.m. in Immokalee, Florida, as Alejandrina Carrera begins the 40-minute walk to her sister's house to drop off her 2 small children. Every day, hundreds of migrant farm workers, like Alejandrina, come to this parking lot in the center of town, where they board old school buses that take them to the fields. Hey! Alejandrina picks tomatoes on a farm about 30 minutes away. She likes her job now, says she's treated with respect. But it wasn't always that way. Alejandrina came to Immokalee from Mexico more than 20 years ago. She was alone, just 14 years old, small, scared, and extremely vulnerable. She says it didn't take long for someone to take advantage of her. It happened at one of the first farms she worked at. She says her boss promised her a better job in a warehouse. But as soon as she got in his truck, he drove to a remote part of the farm, and she knew she was in trouble.
Y el Señor me dice, si no haces por las buenas.
He told me, if we don't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. I was afraid and trembling. He tried to abuse me sexually, but he didn't get to because another worker heard me screaming and came to help me. The next day, the boss fired us both.
John S. Forms is co-owner of Sunripe Certified Brands, where Alejandrina works today. His family-owned farm is one of the largest in the U.S. and was the first to join the Fair Food program, an innovative initiative that has been held up as the most comprehensive social responsibility program in U.S. agriculture. Today, nearly every farm in Florida has signed on. The program combines a set of high standards that includes monitoring the farms and educating the workers. The Fair Food program works because it has market consequences. If a farm violates the code of conduct, it is suspended from the program and cannot sell to participating buyers, which includes some of the biggest fast food restaurants and grocery stores. It all makes a big difference for those at the bottom of the supply chain, like Alejandrina.
Voy a trabajar libremente.
You can work freely. You're not going to be harassed. You're not going to be insulted. You're not going to be forced to work. There's more respect now.
These days, Alejandrina wakes up in the morning happy to come to work, proud to talk to her kids about the company she works for. And that, she says, is the biggest change of all. Amara Walker, CNN.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. But actually today I get to say good afternoon to a very special group of people who are my friends and families here from Charlottesville, whom I don't usually get to speak in front of, including my lovely wife, Laura, who's a proud daughter of this fine city. Laura, could you stand up for a second? Laura's also a co-founder of the CIW. And Laura and I, and our son Isaiah and I get to come here once a year for about a month, enjoying the rivers, the mountains, the downtown, all the many splendors of this fine town. So I consider myself part Charlottesvillian. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the future of food. And you can't really talk about the future of food unless you talk about the present of food, especially the present of food from the farm worker side of the farm gate. And to do that, I wanted to ask you to start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're driving on a beautiful country road winding through the Virginia Eastern Shore. You come upon a bucolic farm stand full of corn and big, beautiful watermelons and tomatoes. The kind of corn that's got, sweet corn that's got those kernels that you pop it, the juice just squirts everywhere, and the watermelons are cut into slices so you can taste them, and the tomatoes still smell like the plants that they were plucked from in the morning. So you stop and you fill your bags with as much of that mouth-watering produce as you can. And you go to the cashier, hand it over, cashier starts ringing you out, and suddenly your reverie is broken by a horrible scream. a screen right over the shoulder of the cashier in the fields where your produce is being picked. And you look up and you see a young woman in the back of a boss's truck being sexually assaulted by the boss. And as that field starts to come into focus, you realize in another corner of the field there's a worker who's on his knees trying to block the blows from another boss, the kicks and blows from his own boss, with a cup of water on the ground. And the boss is yelling, "Did you come here to work? Or did you come here to drink water, you lazy mother?" And just then, the cashier turns to you and says, smiling, "That'll be $21.50, cash or charge." What would you do? Would you complete your purchase? Would you take the money out of your pocket, hand it to the cashier, drive away happily with your food? Anybody? Good. You passed the basic human test. I've asked the question now to basically thousands of people across the country, and not one has said that he or she would actually buy the food after witnessing those abuses. And yet, we do. We all do, me included. We don't ourselves actually buy the fruit because we don't generally buy our food straight from the farms. But yet we do because we buy our food from giant retail food corporations. And they buy from the farms, and corporations are not like human beings. Now, don't get me wrong, those same corporations are made up of men and women, just like you and me. I happen to actually know a lot of them personally. Empathetic human beings who, if faced with the individual decision to buy that food after having seen those abuses firsthand, would not do so, just as you and I would not. Yet somehow, when those same people come together in the form of a corporation and are faced with that decision and make that same decision collectively, their collective tolerance for abuse shoots through the roof. And when buying the food they buy to sell to us, they do indeed turn their backs on what they know to be generations of unconscionable farm worker exploitation, poverty, and abuse every single day. And buy millions and millions of pounds of produce a year from fields that more than 50 years ago were exposed by Edward R. Murrow as America's harvest of shame. And that willingness to turn a collective blind eye is why, in fact, the present of food is what it is today. That's why 80% of farm worker women report being subjected to sexual harassment or sexual assault at work. 80%. That's why Florida was called, just a few short years ago, ground zero for modern-day slavery by federal prosecutors, and why 1.5 million farm workers continue to live in grinding poverty doing the hardest, worst paid, least protected work this country has to offer. And if you question that last statement, just ask yourself, what other job do people do today where they're sitting there on the job thinking, I just can't wait till the day I can grab that bucket and go start picking tomatoes? Not a one. It's the lowest job on the lowest rung on the job ladder. And yet it's one that's important enough to touch each of our lives, each and every single day. So how do we get from that decidedly depressing present of food to a brighter, more modern, more humane future of food? We can't answer that question without looking at the question of power. The crimes that happen in the fields every day are crimes of power, rooted in the historic imbalance of power between farm workers and the rest of the industry of which they are a part. And the only way to stop and ultimately prevent those crimes from happening in the future is by redressing the underlying imbalance of power at their root. Farm workers started organizing in Immokalee, Florida in the early 1990s. But frankly, we didn't really get anywhere until 2001, when we realized that the real problem wasn't the farm bosses who beat and harassed workers daily, whom we confronted on a daily basis, or even the growers who paid sub-minimum wages and cooked the books to avoid detection by the occasional Department of Labor audit, whom we sued as often as possible. Rather, the true root cause of the poverty and abuse of workers in Immokalee, and everywhere around the country where produce is grown and picked, lies in the huge, consolidated, multi-billion-dollar retail food companies at the top of the food industry. Companies like Costco, Kroger, and Wendy's, for example, that leverage their volume purchasing power to demand lower and lower prices for produce from growers. That downward pressure on prices at the farm gate is translated into downward pressure on wages and working conditions for farm workers in the fields. In short, we only started making progress in 2001 when we declared to the world, Taco Bell makes farm workers poor. And that leaves me with 0 seconds left on the clock. We can get to some of this later, or if you have a couple minutes more, we can do that. In 2005, we signed an agreement with Taco Bell with 2 key elements. 1, to pay a premium to help raise the wages of the workers who pick their tomatoes, and 2, to only buy tomatoes from farms that we find to be in compliance with the human rights-based code of conduct that we, a farm worker organization, drafted, and as a corollary, to suspend purchases when farms fell out of compliance. 10 years later, we instituted the Fair Food Program on 90% of the Florida tomato industry and transformed that industry from ground zero for modern-day slavery to the best workplace environment in U.S. agriculture on the front page of the New York Times, including the transfer of nearly $30 million in Fair Food Program premiums from retail corporations to workers, the elimination of sexual assault and forced labor, and the drastic reduction of all the other ills that have plagued farm workers for generations. In short, when Alejandrina first came to Florida's fields, women harassed by their bosses had to decide whether they could afford to complain and lose their jobs, or just put their heads down, suffer the abuse, and keep their jobs, along with the ability to put food on their families' tables. 999 out of 1,000 times, they decided not to complain, and the abuse continued unabated. Today, however, thanks to the Fair Food Program and its protected complaint process, women no longer have to fear losing their jobs if they're subjected to abuse. Instead, if a complaint is made and the supervisor is found guilty of sexual harassment with physical contact, that supervisor must be fired. And thanks to the Fair Food Program's market consequences, the grower now has to decide whether he can afford to lose the business to the 14 of the largest buyers in the world and stand by his supervisor, or fire the long-time valued supervisor and stay in the program. And 999 out of 1,000 times, the grower decides to fire the supervisor. The economic consequences of complaining about sexual harassment are reversed, and the fields become a more humane place to work with each and every complaint. Thank you.